Welcome to this video where we're going to take a look at the color mixer in Adobe Camera Raw. The color mixer is 8 sliders. Each of those can affect either hue, saturation or luminance. Now we also have exactly the same within Lightroom. In Lightroom I noticed that they're still called hue, saturation and luminance, HSL, which is the name that they used to be given in Adobe Camera Raw, but it changed to Color Mixer in 2020. So if we wanted to affect the hue in this particular shot, I'd need to select the hue option first. And if I were to go down to the blue slider and I move it to the right, well, I think we're all pretty familiar with what the hue may do. To reset any of these sliders, of course, just move your mouse over the pointer, double click, and they'll snap back to where they started from. I don't think that saturation needs a great deal of explanation to amateur photographers. When I select it here, of course, I do get the opportunity to adjust those colours and target individual colours rather than use it as an overall volume. But what about the luminance sliders? Here's something that I found online. Quite a lot of technical stuff here, but this doesn't help me to get better images. And I think it's why we use Photoshop and Lightroom, because what we want is the technical boffins to take care of those issues for us and just provide us with a slider. And when they do, we see that luminance simply makes the colours lighter or darker. When we edit our images, whether it's in relation to colour or anything else, we generally start by making global changes that affect the entire image. Then we move on to those strategic changes in selected areas. Now I've gone ahead and made 1 or 2 global changes to this image. But when we start to think about the color mixer, I think of that as strategic simply because it can be targeted at any one of 8 colors, either hue, saturation or luminance, or in fact we could select them all together. So I'd want to deal with my overall color balance and general color saturation before considering the color mixer. If I began my color editing within the color mixer panel here, and then I was to go back to the basic tab and look at things like white balance, temperature, tint, vibrance and saturation, then I'm going to alter the changes I made in the color mixer. So let's take a practical look at using the color mixer. Looking at the settings in this basic tab, you can see that I've made a few changes to this image. So all of my global editing has been done, including the highlights, shadows, whites, blacks. I've adjusted the vibrance to what I think is correct, and I've adjusted the white balance. But now I can turn back to my color mixer and we can just target one particular color. My own experience with colour tells me that to get the depth of colour I like in one part of the image can often upset the colour in another. And the colour that's often upset the most is blue. Suppose that after looking at this image, we want to move away from the colour mixer for a moment and actually add a little bit more colour in that beach and the foreground. So let's jump back to the basic tab and make that change. I've already got quite a healthy slug of vibrance in this shot, but I can try pushing that up a bit more, and straight away you can see quite a bit of impact on the sky. If I was to add just a tiny bit of saturation, well, it starts to get a little worse. The blue now looks a little unnatural, so perhaps here is where we can use the color mixer to address that. Either the saturation, the hue, or maybe even a bit of both. So let's drop down and reopen our colour mixer and take a look. Perhaps we can think of the hue setting as being generally a corrective change to colour, whereas saturation is a more creative one. Now I've noticed with my own images that a slight change in the blue slider, adding something like +8, maybe a little more but not too much, often shows improvement to me. I think we need to remember that colour is a very subjective subject, but I think we also want to avoid any colour in our images that's looking wildly unnatural. Any changes we're likely to make in the colour mixer, I'm going to suggest are going to be more on the delicate side. So going back to that issue I spoke about a few moments ago with hue, if we select the Hue tab and I go down to my blue slider, sometimes when I drag these sliders I find it a little difficult to drop them exactly where I want them. Now one of the ways I find easier is just put the cursor into the little box on the right. Then I can use the up and down arrow keys to make my change. Now I was talking about changing the blues to say a +8, somewhere around there. But I do need to use my cursor here because if you look up at the blue sky as I double click to reset it, you can see the slight change. It is subtle, but I found that if I increase that blue hue, probably 8 or 10, but we can go a little further now. Now I'm up to, what's the number in there, is 16. If you look at the small white clouds just about centre top, you're starting to see a magenta coming through. So we've clearly input too much blue there. So I'm going to hit the down arrow and I'm going to come back to my sort of standard area around about +10. If we look up at the centre top of the screen, we can see that the saturation I've put into this image in the Basic tab is now beginning to bleed through those white fluffy clouds. Now that's not quite right, and it's really telling us that there's too much saturation on the blue. So if we come down to the colour mixer and I select my saturation tab, I can go down to the blues. I can use my method where I put my cursor into the box and use the cursor control keys up and down. I can pick up the slider, but if I go just above, I can click and drag and the slider will move. So you can see that I can just drop that down a little bit, just until I see a nice degree of whiteness coming through the clouds. And of course, if you can start to see a hint of magenta, and can I see that here, then that may be cause for us to go back to our hue and maybe back off a little bit from the +10 that I put in there a few moments ago. Everything is going to be subjective and it's going to be pretty delicate in this window. So once I've got the correct hue in the blue sky, or at least one that suits me, and I've got my saturation set, if I did want the sky, the blue part slightly darker, I could switch to the luminance slider, go down to my blues once again, and I could drop that down. As I've said a number of times, it's all going to be down to personal choice. What I'd like to do next though is to take a look at the targeted adjustment tool. To do that, I think we'll switch to a slightly different image. What I've done with this image is much the same as the previous one. I've gone through the Basic tab and I've made adjustments to the colour, clarity and contrast of the image. I've got the tones into, I would say, 2/3 of the image, which I'm happy with, or the colours that I'm happy with. But I'm not very happy with the sky up here because it's going almost green. So we're going to have a look at seeing if we can make some adjustments to that using the targeted adjustment tool. Now I'd suggest that the problem we have up in this area is the hue rather than the saturation, so I'd need to go to the Hue tab, but I may be a bit unsure which of these sliders is going to affect this the best. So that's when we can experiment by using the targeted adjustment tool. Because when I pick that up and move on to the picture, I get a little target there. So I can go to the area of the sky there which is now beginning to lean towards green, and I can click and drag. If I drag to the right, you can see the slider down there moving more towards blue. So I'm just moving subtly away from the green. And if I move down a little bit to that colour and do the same thing, there it's going more towards green, there it's coming back towards yellow. So with a few touches of this tool, and we can use this tool via hue or saturation. So if I click on the saturation tab, for example, and I click on that cloud at the horizon, I could just drop the impact of that down. So we can make subtle changes very quickly and easily with the targeted adjustment, and we don't have to worry about which slider we need to tweak. In fact, we can let the targeted adjustment tool tell us which ones are relevant. Now, I'm not sure there's a great deal more I can say about the colour mixer, as I've said already once that colour is quite subjective. We're all going to choose something different. This image, just to finish off this video, has had no editing whatsoever. It's just been opened up into Adobe Camera Raw. And I'll remind you once again that what we've done here is very much identical in Lightroom. Let's go to the colour mixer, because here we may want to look at the saturation. And maybe we could use the targeted adjustment tool here. Because if you wanted to make a little more of the pink of the flower, then we can click and we can drag to the right. We may find the greens in the background a little bit heavy. Well, maybe we could click on those and move those slightly to the left. Then, if we just went to our circular filter, double clicked on the screen, hit the V key to remove that, and drop down the exposure, we've got a result in just a few seconds. If you're viewing on YouTube, can I encourage you to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell, because then YouTube will tell you whenever I post a new video. It's all very convenient. If you'd like to download this video in HD resolution, then come along to my website and you'll find it available there in the Photoshop menu. I'll see you next time.